I mentioned just a moment ago that India's Prime Minister Manmohan Singh says the country is going to be growing 8.5%. He also says it will only take a couple years before that number hits 10%. Well, my next guest, he's not necessarily in the same camp. He is skeptical. Barry Bosworth is an economist and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He spent the last 2 years studying up on India. Thank you so much, Barry, for joining us today. You're out in D.C. joining us from your headquarters there. Well, let's talk a little bit about India's growth. We've been so focused on China, particularly in the media. I think we've been focused on the amazing growth there and the rate of inflation there, and some fears that inflation will not be kept under control by their government. But let's focus on India. They've had some explosive growth.
Yes, India's been doing very well, particularly the last decade. I think their growth began to pick up in the 1990s. It has been led by very strong performance in services. I think people know about India call centers. Some people don't like them. But a lot of other computer software has been very active. So they were strong to start with in services. And now what they're doing is their manufacturing sector has been gaining steam in the last few years, and it's contributing more and more to growth.
Let's talk a little bit. There used to be a great deal of foreign direct investment in this country, but a lot of their growth these days, at least in the short term, has really been funded by short-term financing. And what's the qualitative difference there? Is there any reason to believe that there's a risk of future growth because of the way they're actually financing the growth?
No, I think India, it is much more a homegrown economic expansion. They are not as reliant on large state enterprises, and they're not as reliant on foreign invested enterprises that were so important in China. And what's happening is the growth is getting broader by this moving into various parts of manufacturing instead of such a heavy reliance on services. So I think it looks very attractive, and it's also domestically led. It's not an export-orientated or that dependent on the global economy. India has been doing most of its growth domestically.
As a result, do you think they're a little bit more insulated to any of what's happening? We've been talking a lot about how interlinked all the markets are now globally. We've been talking a lot about Europe over the last few weeks. Does India represent a country that's much more insulated from anything that's happening globally, and does that make it a safer place for investors?
I think to some extent it does. Because of its reliance on its domestic market, it's not as dependent as China has become on rapid growth in the export sector. It can support itself domestically. It also has a very solid financial system. The banks are carefully regulated. I don't think they're that exposed. Foreign financial investment has come into the country, but not anywhere near the magnitudes in sort of other Asian countries. So I don't think they're very exposed to capital flight or anything like that. It's a very balanced economic expansion on the whole. If it has a problem, it's going to run out of skilled labor. That's its biggest difficulty.
And how will they address that problem, since you raise it as a potential risk to their growth?
I think it's still a very big problem for India. They're surprisingly, given what we thought we knew about India, their education system is very weak. Illiteracy remains very high. What's peculiar about its growth is it's been based on a small percentage of the population that's relatively well educated. It's not like, say, in China, where the growth is centered around unskilled labor in assembly work and manufacturing. That's not what India's been doing. It's been relying very much on quite skilled labor force, and it's going to run out of that labor force if it can't find a way to improve the quality of the education system.
How is the wealth in this country distributed? Well, I traveled through India several years ago, and I will say I was shocked at just the disparity in the wealth levels there. There were a lot of impoverished people in their main cities. Is that still the case, and are there programs to address that?
They have a lot of programs of trying to stimulate employment and other measures at the very minimal level in rural areas. I think that's been their big difficulty. The growth is pretty solid in urban areas. They have a problem that's common to lots of newly developing countries. You can't lift the ship for everybody at the same time. So it's always going to be true that if you started from a point where almost everybody was at pure subsistence level, some people are going to run ahead. So the early stages of economic growth always bring with it so to speak, a worsening of the income distribution. You can't make things better for everybody at the same time. But they've been doing quite well.
Barry, what do you think? What is your outlook for GDP growth over the next 5 years?
I think that they can grow. I'm a little doubtful about 10%, but this has become an economy that's just transformed itself. It really is a feel-good story for what had been an extremely poor country. I think it can sustain it because it's dependent on its own resources. But 10% seems to me high, simply because of this problem about they've got to find a way to reorientate the growth towards less skilled workers so that they participate in the gains. And they got to improve the education system.
All right.
The positive sign right now is manufacturing is improving so rapidly. That's a good job source for a lot of people.